Welcome to Businesstalk, a show that connects you with academic voices and thought leaders from around the world. I'm Deepak, your host from India. Today we have the privilege of welcoming Professor Mark Huselid as our distinguished guest on the podcast. Dr. Mark is a distinguished professor of workforce analytics and director of the Center for Workforce Analytics at Northeastern University's D. Moore McKim School of Business. His work centers on how organizations can rigorously measure and manage the contribution of their people, their workforce systems, and the HR function to strategy execution and business performance. He specializes in designing integrated balance metrics that link workforce initiatives to tangible business outcomes and strategic goals. Dr. Mark has served as editor of Human Resource Management and has sat on numerous academic and professional boards, reflecting his long-standing leadership in the field. Widely recognized for his scholarship, Dr. Mark is one of the most frequently cited researchers in the organizational sciences and has received multiple awards for his contributions. A short after speaker, he has delivered more than 600 talks to executive and academic audiences across the United States, Europe, Africa, and Asia, and has advised organizations worldwide on HR strategy and workforce measurement. Dr. Mark has authored and co-authored several influential books that have helped shape contemporary thinking on human capital and strategy execution. The HR Scorecard, Linking People, Strategy and Performance with Dr. Brian Baker and Dr. Dave Aldrich, introduced a rigorous framework for aligning HR with firm strategy and has become an international bestseller translated into multiple languages. In today's episode, Dr. Mark Huselid shares key insights from his acclaimed book and one of my personal favorites, the HR Scorecard, Linking People, Strategy and Performance. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mark Huselid to the conversation. Dr. Mark, we are deeply honored by your presence and grateful for your time with us today.
Deepak, thank you so much. It's my honor and pleasure to be here. I'm very impressed with your work. You are doing some great stuff and have had a lot of wonderful people on. So thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thanks for
Professor.
getting up so early.
Thank you, Professor. Dr. Mark, you argue that traditional HR metrics like time to fill and training hours are insufficient. Could you walk us through why these conventional metrics fall short and what makes a metric truly strategic in the context of the HR scorecard framework?
Well, sure, Deepak, and thanks for the question. It's interesting. HR metrics or workforce metrics have been with us for a very long time. The ancient Egyptians measured things about building the pyramids, and they measured talent and headcount and all of those kinds of things. So the concepts that organizations need to understand the resources they have and where they are and what they need to get their work done, that's a very old idea. And starting about 125, 130 years ago, organizations started to get serious about thinking about the profession of management and human resource management, then called personnel management. And as the field developed, they started to manage HR transactions. So things like how long does it take to hire someone, time to fill, how much does it cost to hire someone, cost per hire, and those kinds of things. And so if you can imagine a human resource or personnel leader and she or he is worried about her budget and how much she's spending, how much she's working to staff the organization, the cost or the focus was naturally on transactions as I've described them. The problem is that the transactions, all of the transactions, are such a small proportion of an organization's overall spend, maybe 5% or so. And so even if you were to do world-class work in shortening cycle time or cost per hire, that doesn't really tell you anything about the organization, the talents you have, the talents you need, and the gaps. So during the 20th century, in many economies, you had this burgeoning literature on measuring HR transactions. And frankly, it was often quite dysfunctional because it drove some of the wrong behaviors. So when I say that those transactions aren't what we have to look for, I'm much more interested in talent than I am in transactions and understanding those outcomes.
Professor, the concept of the strategy map is central to your book. It visualizes the causal chain from people to shareholder outcomes. Can you
Mm.
share an example from your consulting work where a company strategy map revealed unexpected insights about where HR could create the most value?
Mm. Yeah, and the concept of the strategy map is basically it's really an engineering diagram or a process flow diagram. And Kaplan and Norton at Harvard really pushed this idea in their concept of a balanced scorecard starting about 20, 25 years ago. And we co-opted those models into HR. And the basic theory or the problem that we're trying to solve is that in organizations, we spend on talent today. We hire people, we train them, we onboard them, we bring them in for returns that are going to come sometime in the future. It's kind of like education. We go to school today and for hopeful returns in the future. And so for any leader or manager, she's got to understand how what she does today drives those outcomes in the future. So if you want to understand how, shortening cycle time increases customer retention, or how customer satisfaction ends up building and retaining more customers, you need to understand how talent drives those outcomes. So a strategy map, just to describe what it is a picture of that process of how that's going on. And so how do we use it in organizations? In my experience, sitting down with a leader and a manager and say, tell me why you hire assistant managers or accountant twos or whatever the role is, and how does their performance affect your bottom line? And having that conversation and walking through, well, high performers do this and low performers do this, and this is how this is reflected in the outcomes, is a really important part of the process. And what they often found, and what I found over and over again, is that we make a lot of short-term decisions because we focus on costs, kind of following on our earlier discussion about lowering costs for hire. And in fact, that ends up increasing our long-term costs because we don't have the talent we need when we need it. So the strategy map, again, it's really a picture and a process diagram about how investments today affect outcomes in the future.
Professor, one of the 5 key elements of the HR scorecard is right types of HR alignment. You emphasize that HR practices should be differentiated across positions, not uniformly applied. How should organizations think about this differentiation, and what are the risks of treating all employees the same?
Yeah, I guess I'm probably older than I look, but I've been studying, or maybe not, I've been studying how organizations manage talent for about 40 years or so. And one of the things that I've learned is that organizations tend to invest hierarchically. What do I mean by that? They tend to spend most of their resources for their senior folks. So the senior executives, they get more training, they get more developmental opportunities, they tend to have an opportunity for more variable pay. And as a result, if you look down in the organization, for example, an entry-level person, someone just joining our team, might not have nearly the developmental opportunities that someone higher up in the organization would. The problem or the paradox that creates is that it's extremely difficult to improve the performance of a senior executive. And as we speak now, the Olympics are on, as you're probably aware, and I'm thinking about how difficult it must be to improve the performance of an Olympic athlete. They're the best in the world, wherever they're from. But think about someone who is, 8 or 10 years old, a child that you or I may have coached in football or baseball or whatever. The variance in performance from the beginning of the season to the end of the season is significant because they're building skills so quickly. They're learning and growing. So an investment in development, ironically, tends to have a higher ROI at the beginning of a person's career than at the end of the career, which is the opposite of what organizations do. So when we focus on alignment and thinking about investing, you really have to think about what are the roles that you're looking for? How does performance matter? And where do you invest? And that's the point that I think we're really trying to make there.
Professor, you introduced the idea of A positions, strategic roles that have the highest variability in performance and the greatest impact on strategy execution. How can HR
Mhm.
leaders identify these A positions in their organizations, and why is it critical to invest disproportionately in them rather than spreading resources equally?
Sure, and it's really the counter juxtaposition of investing hierarchically. Organizations also tend to invest within a vertical plane in organizations. And what do I mean by that? Some roles really disproportionately contribute to your success. As you and I sit here now, globally, everyone is worried about AI and hiring AI engineers and coding engineers. And enormous amounts of money are spent attracting, selecting, and developing those folks. Why? Because the Anthropics, the Metas of the world say the output of these roles really are going to determine our success. So they've focused on those roles because they're strategic, or in our terms, A positions, right? Other roles in the organization might have less impact, and the employees in those roles exhibit less variance. And so the game of measurement is about understanding variance. As I know you know, statistics are all about understanding variance. And many of our statistical tools, analysis of variance, have that in the title. So understanding where the variability in talent is in your organization is key to making investments. Because as a practical matter, we'd love to have top talent everywhere in our organization. That would be great, but it's not practical. And by top talent, I'm talking about world-class talent. And so that's the idea that you need to understand what roles are strategic. And you asked, how do you identify them? Well, that means you have to start with the business. So what's our business? How do we compete? Where do we win? What are the strategic capabilities, those muscles at the organization that really help us disproportionately win, whether it's a Meta or an Anthropic, it's about coding and competence around AI. In a advertising firm, it might be about developing world-class ideas to sell products. The muscles that deliver those outcomes are quite different. The jobs and the work that delivers those outcomes is different as well. So understanding how your customers make those buying decisions mean you can peel back the onion a little bit and say, well, what's the jobs and the work that matter? And that leads you to positions or jobs.
Professor, the HR scorecard emphasizes both leading and lagging indicators within the strategy map. Could you explain this distinction between these two types of measures and how organizations can use leading indicators to predict and influence business outcomes before they materialize?
Yeah, and you said something very important there about predict, because following from our earlier discussion about understanding the business and the capabilities you need to win, the question is, what are the outcomes that you're trying to drive? Why are we here? Why do we invest in talent? So understanding how a world-class performer behaves at a university, at a faith-based organization, at a government, at IBM, it doesn't matter, means that we know what those outcomes are, and we develop metrics around cycle time to fill, customer retention, share of wallet, whatever it is. So those are the lagging indicators. They're the result of what we do. And then the leading indicators are how do we get there? So if you think in terms of a regression model or a multiple regression model, the lagging indicator, that's the dependent variable. The leading indicators are the things that happen that drive it. So if we're trying to increase customer satisfaction or retention rates in some subscription-based service, what is it that determines that, whether it's training or development or time time spent with the customer or customer responsiveness or product knowledge. Who knows? But that's the role of leadership, is to identify what those things are. The role of the HR team, the HR analytics team, is to figure out how to measure them, and then you can put them together. So long-winded answer, but that's the leading and lagging answer that you're looking for.
Professor, in your framework, you talk about HR deliverables, the specific outcomes HR must produce to drive strategy implementation. How do HR deliverables differ from traditional HR outputs? And how can HR professionals reframe their work to focus on these strategic contributions?
Yeah, that's another good question. You know, it's if you think of HR management or talent management in organizations, most managers will tell you that most HR management is not done by HR professionals, but rather it's done by line managers and supervisors that interact with people every single day. HR professionals have a huge and important role to play because they design the plumbing and help design the plumbing that makes that happen. Selection systems, performance management systems, coaching, all of those kinds of things, they're the key designers, so to speak. So the HR deliverables, if you think about it that way, are the outcomes of that design process. So if I'm a CEO and I'm working with my HR team, I would say, I don't want you necessarily to lower costs. I want you to deliver the right system to help me get to where I need to be. So that's what I'm going to hold the HR team accountable for, is that system design, integrated system design. Make it fit together, help me drive the business.
Professor, the book discusses the importance of high-performance work systems, bundles of interconnected HR practices that create synergies. Can you provide an example of how these bundled practices work together more powerfully than individual initiatives? And what mistakes organizations make when they try to implement isolated best practices?
Yeah, it's interesting for me anyway. The history of the profession of HR management, especially in large global companies, has been one of balkanization or isolation. So if I'm an HR leader, I've got a recruiting team, I've got a selection team, I've got a training and development team, I've got folks working on compensation. And if the organization gets big enough, each of those teams tries to optimize what they're doing. That's not irrational, right? You think about, well, if I'm going to manage compensation, let me go figure out the best firms in the world and benchmark to them and manage compensation like that. The problem with that is that as employees, we don't respond to the compensation system. We respond to the system writ large, all of it, right? And so we have to think and kind of from the customer back, in this case being the employee, and saying, what does she need to do her work effectively? So taking a systems view kind of helps you to avoid some problems like frequent problems in HR, where, for example, the organization will say, you know what, we need to be a proactive high performance culture. And we're going to have everyone go through extensive performance reviews. And you're my leader and manager, and we're going to do a lot of coaching. We're going to meet, and that's great. But at the end of the day, we don't differentiate on performance. So we differentiate on performance management, but we don't differentiate on compensation, which happens in organizations, where the top performer might get a 4% raise and the bottom performer gets a 3% raise. And so both I as an employee and you as my boss say, oh, we just spent all this time working on performance review and it doesn't really matter. Or conversely, you might have the opposite situation where we say, look, we're a variable pay organization. The top performer is going to get a 15% raise or a 20% raise, and the bottom performer is going to get nothing. We're going to be tough. And then our performance review process isn't very good and doesn't reflect the actual performance. So there's a lot of kind of dangerous connections like that can happen where A and B is, the whole is less than the sum of the parts, right? And so when we're thinking about designing systems, it has to be a system where there's a synergistic effect. So you compare that example that I just had, which you could say, well, that Mark, that's crazy. That never happens. Well, our research shows it does happen a lot in organizations. You probably have experienced that as well. Think of that or compare that to an organization that's really thought carefully about. We're going to hire talent, maybe for the long run. We're going to select them carefully and onboard them in ways that make sense. We're going to invest in their development. We're going to coach them. And then for those that do well, we're going to promote and pay them consistent with that outcome. Now, that does not kind of system isn't going to work for all organizations or strategies, but that's the point. They thought carefully about designing each piece consistent with the business, not benchmarking which others have. Benchmarking practices can cause you a lot of grief and mischief. Benchmarking process, how did you get there, can be very, very helpful. It's an important distinction.
Dr. Mark, you have written that HR measurement systems must be based on a clear understanding of organizational strategy and the workforce behavior required to execute that strategy. In your experience, what's the most common disconnect between what companies say their strategy is and how they actually manage and measure their workforce?
Oh, gosh. I would say it's just a fundamental disconnect between what leaders often say and what the organization does. So you'll have organizations saying, people are our most important source of competitive advantage. You've heard that probably your whole career. I know I have. And then you look at how people are really valued and held accountable for it. It doesn't fit. So making sure that there's alignment between what is said and what is done is really clear. And also between what is expected and what is inspected. There's an old saying you may have heard, you don't get the behavior you expect, you get the behavior you inspect. You get what you measure, not what you ask for. And I think that's really true. Employees are really, really smart. They figure this stuff out very quickly. You say you want us to, work together in teams and to share knowledge, but you pay me like an individual contributor. So if I share my kind of competitor knowledge with her, I might not close the sale. That's not going to work, and people will figure that out. So being clear about what's really important and then backing that up with thoughtful measures. And when it doesn't work, own it. Say, you know what, we got that wrong. Let's work on it. Let's fix it together.
Professor, the second element of the HR scorecard is right HR cost, which asks whether the total investment in the workforce is appropriate, not just minimalized. This challenges the traditional cost-cutting mindset. How should CFOs and business leaders think about workforce investment as a strategic lever rather than simply an expense to control?
Yeah, my first hero in my life, or heroes, were my parents. And my dad was an entrepreneur, and he would tell me, sometimes it's cheaper to spend more. And it took me a long time to figure out what he meant. And, when I got into school and started reading about management, we started reading about the quality movement and globally and the auto industry in the 70s and the 80s, where there was this idea that quality is free. You have to spend money to build quality into products, but that's reflected in customers. They say, yeah, I like this, I'm going to buy this, and warranty rates are lower. That's a very long-winded way of saying that investing in talent is some of the highest return on investment things that you can do, as long as it's consistent with strategy. And so making those things fit together and making it make sense, I think is the game for leaders. It's very hard to do. That's why you don't see it very often.
Professor Mark, before we wrap up, I would like to finish with one final question. Since the book published in 2001, you have continued to develop these ideas in the workforce scorecard and the differentiated workforce. Looking back, what has been the biggest barrier preventing organizations from adopting this strategic measurement-driven approach to workforce management? And how has the conversation evolved over the past 2 decades?
Yeah, gosh. Yeah, it's been 25 years since that book came out. That's a long time. You know, things have changed, the old French saying, and they have stayed the same. One of the real challenges around measurement in organizations is that measurement systems in most Western economies, certainly in the US, and for the organizations that have kind of a US based accounting system, where we focus on balance sheets, income statement of cash flow. All of those things were really designed a very long time ago to measure physical assets, hard stuff, trucks and buildings and maybe leases, right? And in a world that from the 1930s, 100 years ago, 120 years ago, where physical assets drove most of the value creation, that kind of made sense. But that's not our world anymore, obviously. Intangible assets make up most of the market value in most firms. If you look at the market value of even the tech firms aside, because most tech firms have almost no physical assets, it's almost all intangible assets. But even for firms that are not in the tech firms, only 60 to 70% of their market value is around intangible assets, knowledge, relationships, brands, all of those kind of things, and talent. But the great cruel paradox is that the measurement systems that we have were designed for those physical assets, trucks, buildings, those kinds of things. Just a quick example. If I spend $1 million on a building or some type of asset or trucks or whatever, Western accounting systems say that's an asset, it has a class, it's written down on the balance sheet, and we can depreciate it over time. Well, what does that mean? If I'm focused on earnings, which are reflected on the income statement, I'm only paying for some proportion of those assets every year. If it's a building, it's over a 30-year lifespan, so 1/30. So if I'm a leader or a manager and I'm saying, should I buy the building? Say, well, I don't have to pay for it now. I pay for it over 30 years. I've got a mortgage and I'm depreciating it. So when my investors look at me, they're saying that, oh, well, you bought that building, but that's clearly an investment for the future. Well, here's where I'm going with this. If I spend that same $1 million on talent, right, that's an expense that's written off entirely in the current period. So if you're my CEO and I come to you, if you and I are in a budgeting meeting, or you and I and someone in operations are in a business meeting and she wants to buy a building and I want to spend it on talent, I cost you 30 times what that building costs, right? And so there's a real pushback about making those long-term investments in talent, in part because the accounting systems don't recognize them as physical assets. So it's a real leap of faith. I have to know and believe that the returns are going to be there to make that physical investment. So it's a real challenge around that. So not only do accounting systems in most organizations represent and focus on physical assets, but that's also reflected or cascaded into the managerial accounting systems in most businesses. So if I have a series of trucks in my business and one of them goes missing, right? I know I can figure out that. I know it's not there, and I know who paid for it, and I know who was supposed to be managing it. I've got a world-class employee who quits because his manager was abusive or didn't develop him fast enough or whatever it was. I would have no way of knowing, right, unless I was directly involved with the transaction. And so the challenge or the irony is that our highest return assets, talent, strategically focused, is our least well measured asset as well. And that's a problem. So organizations have to proactively go and design these systems and build a bespoke measurement system to solve the problem because it's not embedded in the accounting system. And by the way, accountants are well aware of this, but it's just very difficult to overcome.
Thank you, Professor Mark, for sharing your insights and experience with us today. Your reflections on workforce analytics and strategic HR have given us a richer, more practical understanding of how people decisions shape organizational performance. We are grateful for your time, your generosity in answering our questions, and the clarity with which you connected research to real-world practice. It has been an absolute privilege to host you, and we look forward to learning from your work in the years ahead. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Deepak. It's been a pleasure.